counted among the outlaws. He said, "Come, follow me." People from all walks of life since have been becoming outlaws.
Did you know the world's top 3 major religions all are expecting the soon arrival of a Messiah? That's right, all 3. Islam, Judaism, and Christianity. Not only expecting, but all 3 believe it could be imminent anytime. Let's not forget about the Christians also have the expectation of the rise of a false Messiah, the Antichrist. The arrival of these religions' messiahs will be nothing like the world has ever seen, according to all 3 religions. Is that coincidence? What's going on here? Are they the same figure? Are they different? What are the similarities? To help us figure this out, we have back again acclaimed apologist Abdu Murray. Abdu was raised a Lebanese Muslim until he took a 9-year historical, philosophical, theological, and scientific investigation. That's the way to do it, by the way. That led him, of course, straight to the Christian faith. He's authored several books, including Apocalypse Later, Why the Gospel of Peace Must Trump the Politics of Prophecy in the Middle East, Saving Truth in Grand Central Station, and more recently, More Than a White Man's Religion, which he's been on recently, and we talked about a couple topics from that book. What the Bible has to say about slavery, as well as women in the church, and that's a good one if you haven't heard that episode. He is also the founder and president of the Embrace the Truth organization. Welcome back, Abdu.
Ken, it's great to be with you, man. Thanks again for having me.
Abdu declare.
That's right.
You've probably heard that before, right? It just popped in my head.
I have never heard that. You're actually the first person. That's actually the first time someone's done that. No, I'm in all seriousness, I get a lot of jokes about my name, but you're the first one.
I shouldn't bring a guest on and immediately joke about their name, but I feel like I can.
I've been here before, so
that's
now
right.
We're so familiar that you can go ahead and make fun of me all you want.
Yeah, I'm obviously feeling too comfortable. I don't know. Maybe I'll edit that out, but it struck me as funny. Being raised Muslim was typical. That was part of your culture, your surrounding, your family. What even led you to begin to think about considering something other than what your comfort zone was?
Yeah. So I started off actually trying to knock the faith out of anybody who wasn't a Muslim, and then put Islam into the void that I had created, of course. So I was raised in a suburb of Detroit where there was not a lot of Muslims. There was just not a lot. Now there's a ton. It's actually a very diverse area, ethnically and religiously. But back in the 80s and in the 90s, it was still fashionable to say you were a Christian, even if you didn't mean it. And so people would say, "Oh, I'm a Christian." And I'd say, "Well, what does that mean?" Actually, what I would ask them is the question, "Why are you a Christian?" And they would say something along the lines of, "I don't know, we go to the Presbyterian church on Christmas and Easter, so I'm a Presbyterian." I'm like, "Well, I don't know. Was that a question or was that an answer? I'm not even sure you know why you're that thing." So I started to say to them, "Are you telling me that you trust your eternal soul to a worldview that someone else has thought through, but you haven't thought through it?" And they're like, "No. You didn't think through matters of faith and religion?" I'm like, "Well, yeah, of course you can. And by the way, I've thought through your religion for you. Here's 15 reasons why you're wrong." And I would start to launch into issues about the Bible, and it's been changed and corrupted. Now, that's important because Muslims actually believe that God has revealed parts of the Bible by name, certain parts of the Bible, but then it became corrupted over time, such that the Quran, the holy book of the Muslims, needed to be revealed. I would start to launch into my attacks on the Bible, but also the incarnation of Christ, that, Jesus can't be God. That's horribly blasphemous, and that denigrates God's greatness. The Trinity, I would say the Trinity makes no sense. How can you possibly believe this thing? And the cross, I thought, was the biggest insult because, the central framework I operated from is a very Islamic framework, which is, you hear the phrase all the time. You hear it now in the news, especially with all that's been going on. We hear a Muslim say, "Allahu Akbar." And whenever you hear someone say that, something terrible happens. But the reality is most Muslims say that phrase. Peaceful Muslims who are not interested in blowing up the place. They're just peaceful Muslims who are looking to live the American dream and move on with their lives. They say this phrase too all the time. In fact, the phrase is so important that it's got a name. In Arabic, the name for the phrase Allahu Akbar is takbir. It literally means God is greater. So for the Muslim and for me, God's greatness was the most important part of what it meant to follow Islam, because I thought Islam extolled and explained God's greatness, whereas other religious faiths tried to, but Christianity in particular failed because the Trinity, the Incarnation, and the cross all insulted God's greatness. So I made it my goal, not in an angry way, more in a conversational way, to get people who weren't Muslims to see that if they wanted to worship a God who was truly great, they should turn to Islam to do so. Well, as I said before, I tell Christians, tradition shouldn't be a reason you believe something. It should be believed because it's true. And that was right. I was right to say that. But two guys come to the apartment complex I was living at the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and they were preaching the gospel to me. And I was talking to them, and frankly, we were engaging in hours long conversations, weeks on end. And they challenged me. I challenged them back, but I really wanted these guys to become Muslims. So I began to look at the Bible to find a contradiction in that Bible. And here's what got me going on this. I wanted to find a contradiction in the Bible. Again, so I'm reading this Bible, not wanting to believe a thing it says. But I come across Luke chapter 3, verse 7, and the following verses as well. And John the Baptist is baptizing people. And he says to them, "Who told you to flee from the wrath to come?" Meaning, of course, God's judgment. And then he says something remarkable. He says, "Do not even begin to think to yourself, you have Abraham as your father," as if that would save them. Their lineage would save them. "For I tell you, God can raise up children of Abraham from the stones." That struck me, because what John the Baptist is saying is that your tradition does not save you. Truth is what saves you. Why that irritated me was because I was saying the same thing to Christians. No Christian had ever bothered or haven't really had a chance to ask me, "Why are you a Muslim?" And had they done that, I would have given them some, lines about why I thought the Quran was God's word and all that stuff. Um, but the real fundamental reason was because I was raised that way, and I had to be, because that's my heritage, that's my lineage. And so I was getting mad at Christians, not getting mad, but criticizing Christians for believing something because of tradition. But that was my real reason. I want you to note something, is that the Bible is the book that got me thinking about the real motivations for my own belief. So the very book I was criticizing as being corrupted over time was used by God to get into the hands of a skeptic like me, to actually speak to me and challenge me on my motivations. So that started the journey. I thought to myself, I'm going to believe something not because it's tradition, but because it's true. I was fully confident Islam would win, but I wanted to be as objective as I possibly could. And that's what really began the journey. It had started a little bit before that, but more on a curiosity level. But the real, honest, earnest journey of trying to find out what is true and what faith really talks about who God is and does God even exist started then. I wanted to know if it was true, not just tradition.
And you can come to a place where apologetically you're like, this faith is true, this lines up. Do you get a place too where you felt it was true? I mean, that you had an encounter with God that you hadn't had as a Muslim.
Yeah, there did come a place. Remember what I said, right? So I said that Allahu Akbar, God is greater. That is the single most important goal, or the belief. It's in Islam. All other beliefs are subservient to that fundamental belief. There came a time, it took 9 years. There came a time when I realized that the things I was hoping were true in Islam, I found to be really true in the gospel. So remember what I said about God being the greatest possible being? Well, whether it's the Trinity or the Incarnation, these things actually demonstrate God's greatness, and there's a number of reasons why that is. But the thing that really got me was the cross itself. I thought the cross insulted God's greatness, but then I realized something. If God is the greatest possible being, then he would express the greatest possible ethic. And because if he didn't, he wouldn't be the greatest possible being. What makes a being great is his ethics, amongst other things. So he would have to express the greatest possible ethic. Well, what is the greatest possible ethic? It's obviously love. And so if he expresses the greatest possible ethic, he would have to do it in the greatest possible way. Otherwise, he would be a half-baked God, like like Hercules or Achilles or some version of these kind of things, or Osiris or one of these demigods kind of a thing. No, if he's the greatest possible being, then he would express the greatest possible ethic in the greatest possible way. Well, what is the greatest possible way to express love? When you just look at it, and the Cliff's Notes version is, it's obviously self-sacrifice. You can do a lot of things that are loving, but until you sacrifice for someone, until you do something that hurts you, but for their sake, you haven't really expressed love in a true fashion. Um, in Islam, there is no such thing as a God who sacrifices, but in the gospel, it's the central thing. And so, what I was hoping to be true about God in one worldview ended up being actually true about God in the Christian worldview, in the very worldview I was hoping wasn't true, but ended up being actually true. And when I realized that, and you see it, by the way, I remember where I was when I read it. Romans chapter 5, verse 8. For God demonstrates his love, his greatest possible love, in that while we were sinners, those who hate God, Christ died for us. Greatest possible being, greatest possible ethic, greatest possible expression of it. He didn't just die for those who love him. He died for those who hate him, to transform them into those who love him. And it seems to me that the kind of God who would not only sacrifice, but take on the very enemy of humanity, death itself, and our sin, is the kind of God who's worth believing.
Turning the conversation a bit to these three messiahs, we can
Mhm.
start with the Islam version. And from my layman's view, I'm aware that there's different, whether you're Shiite or Sunni, there may be a different understanding of what that means. But I think you were starting to allude to that they believe this has become corrupt, our scriptures. And how does that play into a coming Islamic Messiah?
Yeah, so great question, and yeah, I do appreciate your understanding of the subtlety between the different sects within Islam, whether it's Shia, Sunni. There's also sects within Sunnism or Shiism where they have some differing understandings as well, whether it's Seveners or Twelvers or Ismailis or whatever it is on the Shia side and other things on the Sunni side. Essentially, let me just boil it down to sort of the essentials, is that the Muslim faith, the Islamic faith, would teach that God is that Jesus will return. He actually does return, but he returns as essentially the general or the leader, the commander of the armies of believers against the armies of the unbelievers. That Jesus will die in a battle with those unbelievers, but then he will rise up again, be raised to life, like all of us eventually will, because Muslims do believe in a bodily resurrection of generally not of Jesus, but of people generally, and then Jesus in terms of having died in that war. But the one who is actually the Messiah in the sense of the one who will establish the Islamic rule on earth forever is not a Messiah in a strict sense. So the word Messiah, of course, comes from the Hebrew Mashiach, anointed one. And while Jesus is called in the Quran, Jesus is called Isa. Isa is not really the Arabic way to say his name. It's really Yeshua, but the Quranic way to say Jesus' name is Isa. But he's called Isa al-Masih. You can see the word Messiah right in there, right? So it's al-Masih. The thing is, though, is that the Quran never actually, in Islamic sources, never actually define what it means for Jesus to be the Messiah. Al-Masih means the Messiah. So there's no real definition of this word or understanding of what it means to be the Messiah in terms of Jesus. However, Islam does have a figure called the Mahdi, Mehdi, typically spelled. The Mahdi is, depending on which Muslim you ask, is a figure who either returns after a period of long occultation where he's been hidden for centuries. He's alive, but he's been hidden for centuries, or he's a different figure altogether. And he comes and he again leads the armies of the believers in Islam against the armies of the to vanquish them forever and establish an Islamic rule on earth forever, such that God's paradise essentially becomes to all fruition on the earth. Now, what's interesting is Jesus in that instance actually does have roles. When Jesus comes back, he not only leads the armies of believers in the battle, but he also, in that battle, again, depending on the Muslim you ask, destroys all crosses and symbols of the crucifixion, kills all the pigs, which is just really sort of a interesting detail, um, and establishes prayer, among the Muslim nation called the Ummah. Um, but then he dies, and then he raises up again. And the Mahdi is the one who actually is the ultimate leader, a human leader, not divine, but a human leader of the Muslims. So that's the Islamic version. It's got a lot. There's a lot of wars, obviously, and depending on which Christian you ask, there's a lot of wars in Christian eschatology as well. But you have Jesus not coming to end all wars, but to use a war to end all wars.
And is it correct that pretty much the Jesus comes back and says that scripture had been corrupted, how it came about, how we read it now isn't true, and that Islam is true?
Yeah,
And
you're right. In fact, the Quran actually says that Jesus has already said that back when he was here 2,000
oh,
years ago, and he's just going to repeat it, but with force.
right. Because it seems like, in general, at least, if not specifically, the Mahdi and then the return of Jesus in the Christian realm seems very similar. Like they have their hero is our villain. That the Mahdi almost seems to be what we would see as an antichrist figure. And then there's like a false prophet, a religious figure that helps give him and sustain his power and helps the world accept him. I don't know
Yeah,
if it's that simple, but it just seems to be kind of
yeah. Well,
parallel.
I could definitely see that from depending on which perspective, from a Christian perspective, you're talking about. Now, without getting hyper technical, Christians often think that the real debate within Christian eschatology is when the rapture happens. Is it pre, mid, or post trib or tribulation for the uninitiated? That there'll be this period of tribulation, a 7-year period of tribulation, and the debate amongst Christians is whether or not the church gets raptured or taken out of the earth before the tribulation happens, in the middle of the tribulation, or after that 7-year period of tribulation. And then Jesus comes back and establishes a millennium and all this stuff. Now, the reason I bring all this up is because your question is a good one, but it also presupposes one particular version of eschatology. That debate, pre, mid, and post trib, is one debate within one strand of Christian eschatology called
Right.
premillennial dispensationalism. But then there's actually premillennialism, which is not dispensational, and then there's amillennialism and postmillennialism, and then there's a thing called preterism. Those are actually older in Christian theology than dispensational premillennialism. Um, the reason I say that is not because I'm not saying any one of them is right or wrong. The point is that there's actually and those other ones, by the way, those other views, amillennialism, postmillennialism, preterism, they don't even have a rapture.
Right.
And they don't have any sense of an antichrist so much as they interpret John's words in his first letter as not being about an antichrist, but someone who is antichrist. Like it's a position, not a person.
Yeah, or
So
if there was, one of them would be that it was an early Roman emperor.
yeah,
And
yeah,
this has already all pretty much happened already.
right, and that's the preterist view, for example, amongst others. So I say that not again to say one's right or one's wrong. I'm just saying that we have to appreciate the differences within Christian eschatology and not assume that probably the most popular version, which sells books and ends up being in movies, that's usually premillennial dispensationalism.
Mhm.
So now let's assume that that's true, that it is that way. One could argue that that's what you have happening here is that it looks like there's a figure going to arise, and one religion has predisposed people to accepting him as a deliverer, which is how they get deceived.
Yeah.
Um, so that's interesting.
What also would be interesting is if that more popular version is not true and that it's more symbolic or it's already happened in the past or whatever, then you have two other religions that their eschatology seems very similar, but Christianity already happened.
Yeah,
Uh, it just seems more interesting that
yeah.
all three stories kind of line up with the same characters, but with different roles depending on the perspective.
Well, yeah, and the interesting part of it is that they all share a root in one sense. Now, I'm not saying they're all the same because they're not, but they share a root. When you look at the development of Islam, for example, you see Jesus appears as a prophetic figure. He's a prophet, nothing more than that. He's a prophetic figure, and he will return. That sounds similar to Christianity, except that they divest him of his divinity. There's no sense in which Jesus is actually a savior. He's just a figure who tells us to go back to true Islam and obey God's commands. Um, but Islam is very law-based. A lot of the dietary restrictions, a lot of the prayer restrictions, a lot of the stuff actually looks very much like the Mosaic law. So they instead of having a new covenant under the blood of the lamb, because the lamb's blood, meaning Jesus, has never been shed, you wouldn't have to go back. You can't go back. You can't have a new covenant. You have to revert back to the old covenant of law. So in one sense, which is terribly ironic, when when you look at the way Jews and Arabs have been at war for so long, they're so similar if you look at their actual religious practices. It's really quite interesting. So you get a messianic sense of certain things in Islamic theology, both from a Christian perspective and a Jewish perspective. So you wouldn't be surprised to see similarities, even with the Mahdi um, and the role of Jesus. The Jews, of course, don't really see the Messiah um, in the same way necessarily under this new covenant of dying for the sins of the world as Christians might, but they do see it similar in one sense, that there is a Messiah. That role is quite defined. You look at, Psalm 22, Isaiah 53, Psalm 110. You see a bunch of different places where Ezekiel's got plenty of things. Daniel, of course, has references to a Messiah, one like a son of man, who sits at the right hand, whose coming is from old and everlasting, whose kingdom will have no end. You see a lot of this stuff. Daniel chapter 7, for example, is a messianic passage. So you see a lot of this stuff, but what Jews actually believe the Messiah to be is a coming Davidic king, someone in the line of David who shares literally David's lineage, genetically, actually comes from his line, not symbolically, but genetically, and that he sets the world to right. He delivers Israel from all of her enemies. He establishes a nation of Israel through whom all the people of the world will be blessed. There'll be an established kingdom. It'll be forever and ever, and there'll be peace when the Messiah comes. Once the enemies of Israel are vanquished, peace will reign forever. And, there'll be all kinds of harmony and justice and love will be the reign and all this stuff. That'll be the paradigm of future existence. So it's great, right? I mean, it's fantastic. So that's essentially, I'm boiling down a lot of Jewish thought, because you can look at the Talmud and the Midrash and the Mishnah and find a lot written about the Messiah. Those are, of course, books that are outside the Bible.
Well, let me ask you about that.
Yeah.
The books outside the Bible, doesn't that kind of confuse the issue in that their interpretations and thoughts of different rabbis through the years, this and that kind of becomes extra biblical sources and maybe muddles what the expectation of the Messiah is, as opposed to pure scriptural prophetical word?
Yeah, well, it's interesting you say that, because a lot of Jewish thinking, when it comes to actual interpretation of the Tanakh, the 5 books of Moses, the Ketubim, the writings, and in terms of like the prose and the Psalms and these kind of things, and of course the prophets, the minor prophets that follow. A lot of times the understanding is transmitted through authority, which is a very Middle Eastern way to do things. Yeah, so you transmit it not through direct interpretation, but through the authority of that interpretation and who is qualified to interpret it. That's what you get a lot of. Now, the reason why I say that is because that's where you get the Talmud. The Talmud is a book. It's not one book. It's a series of writings that is far in excess in terms of its sheer volume of the Bible, of the Old Testament. It's far in excess of. And what you have is various scholars of different schools of thought interpreting almost every word of the Bible from a certain kind of lens. And what does this word mean exactly? And why is this word, if there's a vagary in the Bible where things seem to change, or there is a sense in which something is ambiguous, there's all kind of interpretations, and around the Messianic scriptures, there's plenty of room for interpretation. So for example, Isaiah chapter 53, where it says in verse 4, surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, smitten by God. Oh, yeah, we've seen him stricken, smitten by God and afflicted, but he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. A lot of the rabbis would say, originally, that's actually the Messiah. Now, what ends up happening in the Talmud, in the Midrash, and in the Mishnah, and different other biblical texts, they started to interpret it after the Christian movement they interpret it as, no, that's not really the Messiah. That's Israel. That's a reference to Israel herself, the actual nation of Israel, which of course is not true. And even the earliest rabbis didn't think so. But my point in sharing this with you is to affirm your question, is that all those extra biblical things are an attempt to clarify what the Bible says. But because so many, how the phrase goes, too many chefs spoil the soup, is that there's so much going on here that the sheer level of interpretation leads to so many different possibilities of what it could mean. So yeah, there's a lot of different interpretations of that. Having said that, what's really interesting is, and I did this in my first book, I talked about this, about what did the Jews expect the Messiah to be around Jesus's time. Since then, they've had different ideas now because of the sort of schism relationally between Christians and Jews, especially when the earliest Christians were in fact Jews, and there wasn't a whole lot of schism to begin with, but because of and after the Bar Kokhba rebellion, there was a lot. But before that, there were two expectations of who the Messiah might be. There was Messiah ben David, in other words, Messiah, son of David, which was a Davidic king who was going to come and vanquish all the enemies of Israel. And of course, at Jesus' time, the expectation was that the Messiah would vanquish the Romans and the Roman occupation. But then there was also an understanding of, it was a minority opinion at the time, but there was an understanding of a different Messiah called Messiah ben Joseph. And of course, the story of Joseph is one of tremendous suffering, but deliverance through that suffering. Sold into slavery, all these things, and thrown into prison, etc. So there was Messiah ben David, the coming king, who with authority, the military king. Then there was Messiah ben Joseph, who was the suffering servant. And so in Jesus' time, the question became, who is the Messiah going to be like? Is he going to be Messiah ben David or Messiah ben Joseph? And what Jesus does as his first coming as the Messiah is say, yes, it's both. He is the king who defeats death, but he does it through suffering. But ultimately, he will be the Davidic king which will establish God's peace and justice and rule for all time upon his second coming, when the Messiah comes again.
For those listening that haven't dug into this or don't kind of know the difference between Judaism and Christianity, this is my quick summary, is that I still consider myself a believer in the Jewish religion, as was mentioned by the early believers. People just thought it was Christianity was a new sect of Judaism. They called it the Way, because everything Christians believe is the Old Testament. It's just that we believe this person was the coming Messiah that the Jews produced. It's not a different religion. In our view, it's the fulfillment of Judaism. And that everything in the Old Testament primarily, well, according to Jesus' own words, was written for him, by him, about him. And it was all a foreshadowing, a physical foreshadowing of a spiritual reality and a kingdom to come. That, Moses would lead people out of physical slavery, and there would be a Messiah who would lead people out of spiritual slavery or sin. So having said that, would it be true then that the Jews who are waiting for their Messiah today are expecting this Messiah, you mentioned, like more of a military David figure, which, by the way, Christians also believed it was a physical bloodline to David, and that we're not moving forward to a spiritual dimension and we're just waiting. Jesus was the wrong one. There's another one, but they're thinking this one will bring them back to Levitical law and sacrificial sacrifices by a third temple. Is that a main belief of Judaism, or is that like a sect of Orthodox Jews that think a Messiah we need a third temple so that we can reinstitute the law, the sacrifices, and that they see that old covenant as the end all be all, that this is God on earth. I mean, this is the kingdom.
Yeah. So I think that that is a sect of Orthodox Judaism, or maybe even conservative Judaism, that would say something along those lines. And I think that there would be some subtlety and differences between those different viewpoints about what are the nuances of how such a Messiah would actually come and do what he is going to do militarily and vanquish the enemies of Israel as well. Whether it results in a new third temple, or it results in no more need for sacrifice because people have been cleansed, etc. There's different views on that. But essentially, what you have is a Messiah who will usher in, who will, like I said, destroy the all oppression and enemies, and who will establish Israel as a both literal and figurative or spiritual kingdom on earth, where there'll be peace and justice and all these kind of things. That's one of the reasons why people have actually, many Jews have rejected Jesus as Messiah, because they said that when the Messiah comes, this is all going to happen. And that clearly didn't happen with Jesus, because the Romans weren't vanquished, but the Romans destroyed the temple in 70 AD. And there's no peace on earth and no lasting peace and all these kind of things. So what did Jesus really do? And of course, Jesus is answering them when he says, remember what I said. I'm both the suffering servant, Messiah ben Joseph, and Messiah ben David. The one you guys have been waiting for is both of these people, actually. You're just waiting. You just think it's one swoop where the Messiah does it once, but maybe the Messiah does it in stages, or in various facets that are a little more subtle than you might actually realize. So they do expect that, like you said, but I would say that that's more Orthodox or conservative Jews. Now, this bears mentioning. When you run into a Jewish person, just because they're Jewish doesn't mean they're religious. Jewishness is an identity, and they may even read the Tanakh and go to synagogue and all these things, but the idea that God is a part of their lives is far from them, because it isn't the religion and the creed that's important. It's the deed that's important. In other words, Judaism creates a sense of cultural wholeness or unity. It's a sense of morality and these kind of things. So don't assume that every Jew you run into, even if they're very proud of being Jewish, is actually religious in any sense of the word that we would come to think. They might not even believe in God at all. I know plenty of agnostic or atheist Jews who are pretty serious about being Jews, but they don't believe that God exists, or they're doubtful about it. Now, that comes as a shock to many ears, but that's actually a very common experience.
Yeah, it's confusing to people I talk to, because, I mean, what other race is defined? They have the same name for their racial identity as they do for their religion.
Right.
So if you bail out of your religion, you're still Jewish, and that's very confusing to people. If you're Irish, that doesn't mean you're Catholic. It could.
Yeah.
But it doesn't mean it. But when you're Jewish, it's very confusing to say I'm Jewish, but I don't follow Judaism,
Right. Or they have what's called the Reform Judaism, or more of a liberal Judaism, where it's more the morality and the tradition that is held. In other words, God was the glue, as a figurative idea, was the glue that held this morality and this culture together. So whether it's true or not isn't relevant, but in terms of God's existence, but that God's existence, belief in God's existence, is what they needed back then to hold the glue together. But now we use the Bible as a guide on how to hold our community together, culturally speaking. So that's the experience. The reason why it's so foreign to Christians is because creed and deed are inseparable.
So we've specifically talked about Jewish Messiah, Islamic Messiah, and then we hinted around a Christian Messiah coming, but didn't really hit it. So what we're talking about there is a return of the Christian Messiah.
Now, of course, it depends on what you mean by the word Christian. I know what I mean when I say it, but other folks might mean something different. It doesn't mean that Christianity is a relativistic faith. It's not. I think that there are those who would say they hold to a Christian ethic or a Christian understanding, but largely symbolic. Much like Jews might say, I'm a Jew, but I don't really believe in God. There are people who say, well, God is a good idea, or maybe God exists. But whether Jesus really walked on water, whether Jesus really rose from the dead, that isn't irrelevant. That's not relevant. It's the message of love and joy, and love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. That's the important. So there are those. And they don't really have an eschatology in that sense, or a coming idea of what a Messiah really is. Jesus delivers us from sin by being a good example, in other words. The good news is that's a minority position. And I think a mere orthodoxy, and I don't mean like Eastern Orthodoxy or Greek Orthodoxy, I mean a mere orthodoxy, and orthodoxy in the sense of believing what it is that Jesus actually taught, and taking it literal where intended and figurative where intended. You have what C.S. Lewis would call the mere Christianity, which is that part of which is that Jesus dies on a cross to save us from our sins, rises from the dead 3 days later to prove that he has power over death, and that our physical resurrection will follow just like his physical resurrection, and that he will return and establish an everlasting kingdom of physical resurrection with a physical heaven where we'll have physical bodies, but they will not be merely physical. They'll be spirit dominated, and there'll be a new heavens and a new earth, and it'll be like that forever and ever, and we'll have intimacy with God. So in Christian faith, in that mere Christianity kind of way, whether you're Catholic or Protestant, Orthodox or otherwise, and whatever other denomination within those three strands you might find yourself, um, there is a sense in which Jesus, not a sense in which, there's a belief, a foundational belief that the Messiah actually came 2,000 years ago in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. And what that means is that God himself incarnates in human flesh. He takes on human skin, as it were. He takes on human flesh. And so Jesus is one person with two natures, a divine nature and a human nature. And that's how the Messiah comes. And that's based on interpretations from Isaiah 53 and Psalms, and the understanding of what the Messiah would be like. Daniel chapter 7 is another good example where the Son of Man is the messianic figure, and he is one from old and everlasting, whose kingdom has no end. And so he has no beginning, and only one being has no beginning, and that's God. And so the Messiah looks divine when you read the Old Testament. And then Jesus is the fulfillment of those prophecies about the Messiah, in that he is the incarnate God the Son, but with human nature. He's the Son of God, and he fulfills all the sacrificial laws that were in the Old Testament. So in other words, we were under the yoke of the law because of our sinfulness. And so we had to shed the blood of animals in order to have that sin propitiated temporarily, because we're higher creatures than animals. And so our sin is far graver. But no animal can stand in my place, because no animal is as good or as elevated of a nature as me. So it can't sit in my place permanently. It can only be a type and shadow of the kind of redemption that is to come. That's why we need to have sacrifices over and over again. But the Bible in the Old Testament looks forward to a day when there will be no need for sacrifice, because an ultimate sacrifice has been made. Isaiah 53 is the culmination of that, where he is pierced for our transgressions, he's crushed for our iniquities, and his chastisement is what brought us peace, and by his wounds we are healed. That's a prophecy of what the Messiah is to go through. Psalm 22 as well, you see that the Messiah is pierced, in his hands and his feet, and they cast lots for his clothing and all these things. These are prophecies about the coming Messiah. And so Jesus, as a man, the incarnate, can stand in our place and therefore be judged in our place. But because he's fully righteous, and only God can be fully righteous, he also has no sin of his own to bear. And so the Messiah is the one who delivers us, not by vanquishing our enemies, because we are in fact the enemies of God, but by paying for our sins, transforms us into looking like his Son. In other words, God sees his righteousness is imputed to us, and therefore we look like Jesus to God. That's our deliverance, and we no longer have any penalty for death. And so there's two comings of the Messiah. The first one is to establish the new covenant, is to deal with sin once and for all by paying on the cross what we all deserve to pay, and arising from the dead to prove that he could do it, and giving that resurrection life and power to us. So that Paul says, who is a Jew of Jews and a Pharisee of Pharisees, says essentially that resurrection power that brought Jesus to life is the power that lives in us. And just as his physical body was sown in corruption into the ground after being brutalized, it is raised incorruptible, and that's how our bodies will be. So that's the first coming. The second coming of the Messiah is when all of this culminates, and it's all, whatever timing God has, the fullness of time has come, and all things will be set right, because Jesus will return. And Jesus, when he does that, will establish a kingdom however complicated that is, depending on your strand of belief within Christianity, he will establish a kingdom that will reign forever and ever, and we will explore God, and understand him, have intimacy with him forever. So we'll have an infinite amount of time to explore the infinite God, which will be in a perpetual novelty. It will never get old. It'll always be novel and always new, and we'll be experiencing this world with uncorrupt bodies, which means that we'll be able to do things we were intended to do, but never able to do because of the sin that corrupts us. So the Messiah has a delivery from sin, and then the establishment of a kingdom. He does both of those things.
So I was just talking recently with someone, doesn't have a lot of Bible knowledge, but a believer,
Mhm.
and about the three messiahs, and not familiar with any of them.
Mhm.
And the response was pretty typical, as I find this terrifying because you're talking about an end to something, or the beginning of something, the unknown, or this is
Yeah.
too much information. It's scary. In the New Testament, it said to encourage, when talking about the coming of Christ, to encourage each other with these words. So to wrap this up, somebody at that kind of level of understanding, what's like a 30, 60-second response of where is the hope as a believer to soon anticipate a return of Christ, which the church has been called to do?
Yeah. Yeah. So it comes down to really this. There's a new heavens and a new earth, which is established. And there will be no more death. The Bible says specifically, there will be no more death, and he will wipe away every tear from their eyes. So everything in this life that besets us, that causes us pain, that sets us back, that constantly plagues us and haunts us, whether it's pain we've caused or pain that we've caused others, all of that will be set right, and they will not exist anymore. It will not be something that sets us back. So this newness that comes from the old passing away, what passes away in the old is that which we hate anyway, that which is decay and things that fall apart. So all of your passions, all the things you love, all the people you will love them and know them better than you've ever known them before, and completely and unselfishly. All the things that you hope for and care about will all be so new and fresh and perpetually new and fresh. That's why the Bible says not to fear this, but to welcome it and to pray for it. For eye has not seen, nor ear has heard, nor has entered into the heart of man that which God has prepared for those who love him. Which means that whatever you're worried about, it won't be bad. Whatever you're hoping for, it'll be so much better than that. So whatever's entering into your ear or entering into your heart or trying to be something you see, heaven and the new earth and the new creation will be so much better than that. All the things you wish were true will be infinitely better than even the things you wish for. It's a hope. It really is a hope to have all the things that plague us and hold us back. The reins are off, and we're living in freedom, incorruptible, without corruption whatsoever, and God himself will be our light.
Counted among the outlaws, he said, "Come, follow me." People from all walks of life since have been becoming outlaws.